Did you know you had pockets?
I have some scungy tissues in there if I did. Maybe there's still time. Ready?
Okay, everybody, I think we'll get started. So, welcome to the second Miles Little lecture attached to Sydney Health Ethics. It's great to see you all here. And it's a real pleasure to invite Bridget Haire, Dr. Bridget Haire, who completed a doctorate with us a few years ago. And she's going to be talking to us about her research, particularly focusing on ideas about engagement and community action. So, Bridget, over to you.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's an enormous honour to be here, to be honouring Professor Miles Little here today, and to be speaking here to you about community engagement. And in speaking about the central role of communities in research, it's important for me to acknowledge the incredible community that I was involved in at Sydney Health Ethics, or VELUM as it was then known. And I want to particularly acknowledge the role of Chris Jordan's in that, and many of you else in this room as well, and Ian Kerridge as well. At VELUM, I found a community that inspired me and that supported me and that challenged me. And it actually literally set me on a new path in my life. And I'm extraordinarily grateful for that. So thank you so much. Now, as many of you know, I came to research after a career in the HIV community sector. And I learnt about research, and particularly about clinical research, as a community advocate. And my core values have been deeply shaped by that experience. I want to begin today by talking about a history that predates my work in HIV. Some of the major ways that AIDS activism, particularly in the US, shaped research in HIV in particular, and later in other fields as well. I'll talk then about how that influenced the Australian HIV community sector, including the ways that it helped to shape community institutions and the way that activist organisations operated and continue to operate. I'll then reflect on how working with community organisations inflects research practice and draw some parallels between the responses to the emergence of HIV and the recent responses to the West African Ebola epidemic. Silence equals death. I could talk about this particular slogan for hours, but I promise you I'm not going to. This clever, pared-back slogan with its multiple allusions became part of ACT UP's iconography in 1987. So it wasn't originally from ACT UP, but the men who put it together then became involved in ACT UP. And ACT UP, of course, stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. 1987 was also the year of the Grim Reaper in Australia. Importantly, it was also the year that the first antiretroviral drug, AZT, was approved. It was 1 year before ACT UP occupied the FDA to demand a more efficient, responsive drug approval system. And I'll return to this point a little bit later on to discuss more about what ACT UP's positions were on experimental drugs. So ACT UP was a collective, and it operated along anarchist lines. It soon had chapters that were springing up around the HIV-affected globe, particularly in countries that had a westernised gay culture. ACT UP protests, or ZAPs as they were known, featured arresting images. Die-ins were part of what they did. And in addition to the images that they provided for the media, they were always very, very certain that they would have articulate and well-briefed media spokespeople, carefully calculated to maximise media attention. Unproductive corporate competition and bureaucratic torpor were the enemy, and clinical trials were acknowledged as being healthcare, not just part of a drug approval system. So there were ACT UP chapters in Sydney and in Melbourne, and there were ZAPs that happened around the country, including at one point Melbourne's floral clock being replaced with little white crosses. There was abseiling over the public gallery in Parliament House in Canberra. And ACT UP Melbourne was also absolutely pivotal in keeping the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital open for a few more years after the first threatened closure. For anyone who's wanting to get a real sense of how ACT UP operated and just how canny they were, I might suggest looking up their FDA handbook from 1988. It's a really great place to start. It's a document that outlines just how the FDA works and how this operated in terms of approving or not approving the drugs that were critical then to people living with HIV. I'm talking about ACT UP because it's important for the context of frustration with indolent systems of drug approval and righteous anger at misplaced priorities. And righteous anger was really quite a theme in the early days of HIV here in Australia as well. Before there was effective treatment, anger was everywhere, even in the rather different environment of the AIDS councils. So in Australia, as some of you would know, gay men and their broader communities, of which many of us were part, organised and put together the institutional structures that were to become our AIDS councils at around about the time of the very first AIDS deaths. And in some cases, they actually formed the AIDS organisations before the AIDS deaths. They set up fledgling organisations that became the AIDS councils that we still have in almost every state and territory today. I began working in one of them in 1994. Now, 1994 was a really dark time for HIV. It was the peak year of AIDS diagnoses in Australia. And as you can see here, it was also the peak year for AIDS deaths. To make things worse, the results of a major clinical trial, Concord, had come out in April of that year. And what it demonstrated was that there was no survival benefit from early intervention with AZT. This called into question the role of CD4 cell recovery as a surrogate for clinical endpoints. And to explain that really quickly, CD4 cells were markers of immune function. The idea was that if you could use them as a clinical endpoint, you could just measure declines in CD4 counts. That meant you didn't have to structure trials around people becoming progressively sicker and eventually AIDS deaths. So clinical endpoint trials were known colloquially as body bag trials. Effectively, the Concord trial was interpreted as calling into question some of the precepts behind ACT UP's positions against randomised controlled trials and against clinical endpoint trials. The results of Concord, together with the community's experience then of what it had been like to be on the very large doses of AZT and dealing with the side effects, fueled conspiracy theories such as that AZT was poison and that people might well be better off taking completely unproven complementary therapies. Further, there was increasing kind of energy behind the notion that maybe HIV didn't cause AIDS. Now, AIDS councils at this stage were fiercely political. And I know that they still are, but not in quite the same way as they were there. There were conflicts between the values of volunteerism and the new professional paid staff like me. There were conflicts between people who were openly living with HIV and those who were either HIV negative or who were private about their status. And one of the extraordinary staff meetings, in fact, the first complete staff meeting that I ever went to, was called by the CEO then of the Victorian AIDS Council, who promptly announced that his HIV status had been leaked to the gay press, that he was going to find out who did it, and the possibility that if this became public, that it would mean the defunding of the organisation. And possibly he may have been, it ended up not being leaked any further than the gay journalist didn't take it any further. But the stigma against people living with HIV at that time was such that it is possible that it would have had very, very negative effects. And it's hard for us to understand today when many of our leaders in the field are people who are openly living with HIV. The major work that was being undertaken by AIDS councils in those days was the recruitment, training and support of care teams who provided social, practical and often palliative support for the dying. And this is a picture of the AIDS Memorial Garden. But there were some shards of light in this. In November of 1994, the ACTG 076 study was published showing that AZT reduced vertical transmission by 2/3. Now, where I was working then in the AIDS Council at the Positive Living Centre, this wasn't just an abstract research finding. One of the centre's clients, a young woman just out of her teens, had just given birth to an HIV-negative baby. She had followed the ACTG 076 protocol prior to its publication with the help of the treatments officer Tony Maynard, and you can see Tony's picture down there. Tony died earlier this year, and her doctor. So Tony knew about this research that was being done. He suggested when she first came to him talking about her pregnancy and saying how she'd really like to have a baby but she didn't know what it was going to mean, he said, why don't we try this? So Michelle had her baby. The baby was born HIV negative. Michelle's baby and Tony's real and perceived role there helped to balance the idea that anti-HIV drugs were poisonous. And I think that the moral authority that particularly Tony gained from that and the knowledge around Michelle's baby really helped to turn some of the tide around this notion and to help open people's minds to the idea that in fact HIV treatment really might have something to offer in terms of helping people to stay alive. And then in the last quarter of 1994, the first data showing the synergistic effects of combinations of antiretrovirals was presented in a conference in Glasgow. This was the beginning of the positive results that by 1996 showed that triple combinations of antiretrovirals could reduce HIV levels to below the point of detection, meaning that people may no longer get sick from AIDS and that it might actually halt this progression that seemed to be inevitable toward AIDS and death. Now, Australia was a hive of clinical research from the first years of AIDS, and schooled by the experience of the US researchers, Australian research centres such as the National Centre in HIV Epidemiology and Clinical Research, which is now the Kirby Institute. I work for the Kirby Institute, and many of you here do. John was then the Deputy Director of NChecker, as we called it. Very catchy title, you can see why it changed. NChecker had community representatives on all of their study committees, and so they were recognising findings that had come out of the US about the importance of having communities involved. Now, the models of engagement weren't always ideal. They tended to feature boozy dinners and terrifyingly technical meetings with wads of incomprehensible papers to wade through. But the intention to facilitate the involvement of affected communities in research was, I think, genuine and important. And of course, we formed ourselves into networks to learn how to read those papers. We fought amongst ourselves about what the research priorities should be, and we strategised about how we might be able to actually have meaningful input in these processes. The first bit of advice that I was given by one of my colleagues was to go straight to the inclusion and exclusion criteria in a study and question every single element of it, every reason for why people were being selected, why they weren't being selected, until you're completely satisfied that every element is fair and justified, and then to use that as a key to get back into the study and to actually understand how the study works. And I must say, it was quite a good start. That was quite helpful advice. What this experience taught me overall was that research has to be responsive to the needs of the populations that it involves, and that this responsiveness can't just be abstract. The people whose lives are going to be impacted by research have to be consulted, and we were part of big consultative networks. Just about anything that you said or did was going to be subject to scrutiny over endless teleconferences. Because it's hard for an outsider to understand what the impacts of research will be, let alone to have the capacity to think of how sometimes subtle alterations in research design can make a study work better in a particular context. But moving on. The early noughties were a very important time for demonstrating how different communities perceived the impacts of research in different ways. One of the newer, very user-friendly antiretrovirals had shown promise in preventing HIV, and this was going to be tested in an efficacy study in populations at high risk of HIV acquisition. I was deeply excited by this prospect, and the ethics of the trials didn't seem to be too problematic. Participants would get standard of care prevention, which was condoms, But we would still get a trial result because we know that you give people condoms, you tell them to use them, people fail to use condoms, and so you get a trial result. If your trial is big enough, you have people failing to use condoms on both sides, not a big problem. The big ethical issue to me seemed to be ensuring that seroconverters got access to lifelong antiretroviral therapy. But I thought that that was going to be possible, and there seemed to be work underway to make that happen. The response from sex worker communities in Cambodia, which was to be the site of the first trial, completely exploded the idea that the trial was a desirable and feasible intervention in this population. The sex worker groups felt that the trial posed unacceptable risks for women living in poverty and frequently supporting not just themselves but also other family members on their income, which relied upon being fit to work when work was there, when work was available, not subject to medication side effects in either the short term or the long term. And then women involved were very, very hung up on the possibility of long-term side effects and the impacts that this could have. The trial, this is the Women's Network for Unity there, that was one of the key activist groups there. The trial was eventually folded after an intervention from the Prime Minister, so it never actually started. The drugs never actually were taken by the women involved. And other trials, similarly being planned in high-risk populations around the globe, also folded, with the exception of a single study that did proceed to have to be complete in one site in Ghana. Now, this is a really complex story. And I'm being reductive and simplistic in some ways to say that the best interests of the communities as they understood their best interests were quite different to the best interests of the communities as the researchers understood them. But in some ways that does go to the heart of the conflict. But if you are interested in this particular issue, I would urge you to read some of these publications. You will note a little bit of shameless self-promotion there, but there are other authors listed there on that particular slide as well. Of note, the experience of these trials sparked a great interest in actually starting to put together a kind of science of what community engagement might mean. They inspired the Good Participatory Practice Guidelines, which were originally written for HIV trials, but now there are versions of them available that talk specifically about TB trials as well, and also for about research involving emerging infectious diseases. So this idea of actually codifying practice around participatory practice in research came essentially from that experience that occurred around the failed PrEP trials. Now, the pill to prevent HIV, or PrEP, was eventually shown to be highly effective in preventing HIV, though it wasn't that single drug that was being talked about in Cambodia. It's a two-drug combination. But that's not to say that the communities who opposed those trials were wrong to do so. It's interesting to note that many of the countries that were slated to actually hold those trials still don't have access to PrEP. And that was one of the reasons that was being discussed, that people didn't want an intervention where they were just used to prove something for the benefit of others. So arguably they did have a point there. And of course people need to be able to make decisions about their own health. And the sex workers who didn't feel comfortable with dealing even with notional side effects were arguably, within reason to do so. That being said, PrEP is now seen as highly desirable in most populations at risk, although some Southeast Asian sex worker communities still remain sceptical, and I did have a conversation with some women about this at the AIDS 2018 conference. But by and large, it's something that activists are now campaigning for. So as some of you will know, PrEP was approved in the United States in 2012, and in April this year, 2018, it was actually subsidised through Australia's Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. Immediately prior to that, it was available through state-based implementation studies, which were, in many respects, access schemes. They were access schemes that collected a little bit of data, but I think predominantly they were access schemes. These state-based studies were driven by extensive collaboration between researchers and community-based organisations, as PrEP access had been identified by both communities and researchers as being absolutely central to achieving Australia's goals of reducing HIV incidence. Now, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that there have been significant tensions between Australian institutional community organisations and activists around the promotion of PrEP. This image is posters in Melbourne, and I can assure you that no funded community organisation had any part in putting together these posters, which arguably present a somewhat unnuanced and politically unpalatable version of what PrEP might actually offer people who are at risk of HIV. Nevertheless, as you can understand, they certainly did attract quite a lot of attention, and they did put certainly the fear of government retribution high in the minds of some of the institutional AIDS organisations. But at this point, I want to divert. I want to take your attention to a different life-threatening infectious disease, one that was first identified in the last decades of the 20th century. Ebola was identified in 1976, and this is a photograph here of the Ebola River. Rather beautifully, the photograph is taken by Peter Piot, who then, of course, went on to head UNAIDS. The first cases of AIDS were identified in 1981, only 5 years later. So these two emerging infectious diseases came out in very, very close time frame. Of course, when we talk about emerging infectious diseases here, there is no notion that the first cases of HIV were in 1981. HIV was obviously a completely ignored infectious disease in Africa for a long time before that. And of course, there were outbreaks of hemorrhagic fevers before we had this notion of an illness with a name, such as Ebola. The West African Ebola outbreak that began at the very end of 2013 caused more deaths than any of the previous 19 outbreaks together. At the height of the outbreak, there was major ethical debate about how to conduct research during such a crisis. I'm going to run you through a list of demands around the issues that came up around how to conduct research. Shorten the drug approval process. The FDA, so the focus again being on the US, must ensure immediate free access to drugs proven safe and theoretically effective. That is, as soon as phase 1 trials are completed, together with clear information to the people who take those drugs that the drugs are unproven, so that people are making choices knowing that they are taking unproven interventions. No more double-blind placebo trials, because giving a placebo to someone with a life-threatening illness is unethical. The FDA must inform designers of clinical trials that will not accept data based on placebo trials. Instead, new drugs must be measured against other approved drugs, or where there are none, against other experimental therapies, different doses of the same drug, or against what is already known about the natural progression. Include people from all affected populations at all stages of infection in clinical trials. The FDA must mandate that drug trials recruit participants from all groups affected. And if a trial requires a homogeneous population, parallel trials must be conducted in the other affected populations. Healthcare providers must be made to pay for experimental drug therapies. The FDA must support rather than harass community groups working to keep community members alive. Now, these issues were all the key points of contention in the Ebola trials, but as you might have twigged, this catalogue of demands is actually taken word for word with just a couple of little ellipses there, directly from the demands of ACT UP New York in 1988. It comes from their action at the US FDA headquarters regarding HIV research. Now, let me be clear here that I am not arguing that ACT UP New York synthesised a universal strategy for clinical research in an emerging infectious diseases epidemic. What I am pointing out is that there can be some important cross-cultural parallels when you're considering how you would go about conducting research, clinical research, into a life-threatening infectious disease if you come from a patient-centred perspective. And of course, ACT UP New York would never let you use the word patient, so I'm just taking that on myself. I actually think it's quite a good word, but it was highly contested in the early days of HIV. So I think the point to take home here is not that there is a single answer, but that there are some real commonalities when you think in a humanitarian way about how it is that you might actually conduct research if you were thinking about the research being in your own community and perhaps in your own body. In the last couple of years, I've had the privilege of working with colleagues from the Nigerian civil society organisation NAVMAS. Now that stands for New HIV Vaccines and Microbicides Advocacy Society. And I've been working with them on responses to Ebola. So not only have they been active in working on HIV, but around the time of the outbreak, where there were some cases in Nigeria, they became involved there. And the responses have mostly been normative responses, but they've also included a small research project that looked at views of a range of people. The people included policymakers, social scientists, and lay members of ethics committees who've been involved in approving clinical trials for Ebola during the West African outbreak. And the countries that people came from are Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, there was also myself from Australia and somebody from the US, and Kenya, which of course is not in West Africa. What we were doing was working using a Delphi method, which is a method for trying to structure a particular kind of consensus building process around ethical research conduct in emerging infectious diseases epidemics. The outstanding point of agreement here was that community consultation and collaboration had to be prioritised, and this process was not seen as being negotiable, even in the extremity of an epidemic with high fatality. The proviso being, obviously, that care needs must take the first priority and the prevention of ongoing infection. So public health and care sitting in a separate box. But if you're talking about research, if you actually have the capacity to do research, you have the capacity to do research with some form of collaboration. The project certainly is shortly going to be reported in Developing World Bioethics, so that's going to be out in the next couple of weeks. What participation in that particular research process demonstrated to me was that community collaboration has manifold functions, even in the context of a health emergency. It was seen as a way that researchers can demonstrate respect through listening and for showing their openness to collaboration and working with communities. It was seen as a way of also maximising feasibility of whatever research is going to happen through drawing on community networks, community knowledge, community ways of doing communication and trust building. And also as a way to strengthening standards of care by engaging with the values of community members in health priority setting that are actually working around the research process. So keeping that notion of there being some kind of healthcare access issue involved there in health research. This reminded me of Paul Farmer's observation that we have to stop setting standards of care unacceptably low in resource-poor settings by using the immoral logic that decent care is not cost-effective or sustainable. I'm going to stop in a moment and we'll have some time for questions, but I want to finish with quoting the words of my friend and colleague, Professor Morenike Falayan, who's an ardent advocate for community engagement in research. Research and research outcomes should not be imposed on people without providing the opportunity for communities to collaborate and to determine the goals, structures, and processes of proposed research. Such engagement helps to build the complex interrelationships between the biological dimension and the consequences of diseases and their social, cultural, and political dimensions in ways that promote health and well-being. Community engagement in research, including public health-related research, is an ethical imperative because both the conduct and the outcomes of research have significant impacts on communities. So to paraphrase ACT UP New York, research can and should operate as healthcare too. So thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure to talk to you here today. If you have any questions about any of this, I'd be delighted to answer you. And Julie has microphones.
So thank you very much, Bridget. Any comments or questions?
Bridget, thank you very much indeed. You've done me proud, and it's Halloween too, so we should have celebrated that. Can I ask, it's a silly question, but I wonder whether you could speculate on why it is that the community involvement in HIV policy was so effective, given that the initial ideology was so hostile to people with HIV. I can very well remember making the first diagnosis inadvertently out at Westmead of a person with active HIV and then having to wait for ages for the results to come through to see if I'd converted. But I can also remember that at that time there was so much hostility from my colleagues and they had so much political influence that there must have been something different about the way that the HIV lobby functioned. It was put down to high education, economic well-being, coordinated action. But we've seen the same sort of thing with, for example, the refugee lobby. And yet it's not had the same political penetration. Politics hasn't been converted in the same way. Can you speculate as to what it is that makes... We're not hearing. Oh, I'm sorry. I want to hear what you have to say. Can you hear better if I do? Okay, well let me reduce that, I'm so sorry. Bridget, can you explain why community action is so successful in episodes such as the early HIV crisis?
Look, I'll have a go at it, Miles. I'll tell you my theories. Although I must say that your comparison with the asylum seeker debate has thrown me somewhat because it's making me think, oh yeah, that's because my immediate answer to that would be social capital. That when you go back to silence equals death, just you're thinking of that particular slogan, reading the accounts of the men who dreamt up that particular poster, you know, these were people who were intensely involved in their own cultural moment. So they were highly educated, clever gay men in the kind of art advertising scene who did that little part. So there were so many people with so many different kinds of high levels of social capital in one way or another, coalescing around a single issue that was affecting them. I spent a very interesting evening at the International AIDS Conference 2000 with one of the top American researchers explaining to me in great detail how he was a long-term non-progressor and how that had impacted enormously on his thinking about HIV. So that's a person who naturally controls HIV in their bodies very, very well. We basically know that eventually those people start to experience immune decline, but at a much, much slower scale than other people. So people at all levels, including people who were directly involved in research and medicine, had HIV. And I think that that made a difference, and they had an enormous amount of social power compared with people, you know, in Ebola-affected countries, for example.
Does this suggest that the Ebola campaign won't be as effective?
I think one of the marvellous things about Ebola is that I think some of the kinds of thinking about research ethics did eventually get heard, and I think that the study that showed the vaccine that worked, and obviously we don't know that it worked according to FDA standards, but FDA standards are not the standards that are necessary in order to actually use that vaccine, and it's now been used in the most recent outbreak effectively. So I think the fact that making a vaccine was not so hard in that particular disease context makes a very, very big difference. But the fact that the vaccine trial that was put together really did use very, very sound communitarian principles of, you know, getting the vaccine into the people who were most affected in a very equitable way is an important point for equity, I suppose.
Thank you.
But certainly the conversations were very different. And the conversations around the standards of care, Paul Farmer's stuff on that is fantastic, you know, about the astonishing, you know, lack of focus on the medicine that was actually available to people who were dying.
Any other comments? Yes.
Thank you very much. My background's actually, I used to be in pharmaceuticals, and I'm now out of that. And I did a medical ethics degree here too, so it's such a pleasure to hear you speak. But my question to you is, coming from clinical research in pharmaceuticals, is what do you, and I can 100% agree with everything that you said, but what is the likelihood of the big pharma being able to put community engagement at the top of their double-blind randomised trials as opposed to outcomes? Do you think they'll actually be able to, and have you seen that happening? Because I've been out of it for a while. Have you seen the big research companies where outcomes is their main focus, putting community engagement up front first?
People can sell community engagement on a couple of feasibility criteria quite effectively, that if you have communities involved in your research, it makes recruitment easier, and you can get through a few icky feasibility problems. And I think, so we have seen community engagement in pharmaceutical-driven research. But, I mean, I would argue we have to fundamentally change the way pharmaceutical companies work. It is extraordinary to see the amount of money that is still spent wining and dining people, on all kinds of things that have nothing to do with actually getting life-saving drugs into people. At the recent 2018 AIDS conference, I saw this amazing slide showing the differential pricing of one of the fantastic new pharmaceuticals, dolutegravir, all around the world. And the pricing bore no relationship to GDP. It was all about what people could negotiate. And it was sickening to see, because the pricing of drugs affects whether people live or die, and we've seen that throughout the HIV epidemic.
Any other comments or questions? Narcis.
Bridget, I was just wondering, in this context, obviously, when there's issues of social justice involved, consumer advocacy and engagement is necessary in order to resolve those inequities, but what I am seeing in my own research, perhaps, is industry perhaps leveraging off these experiences to surreptitiously push through a deregulation agenda to reduce the standards of evaluation, because consumers want it and they keep pressuring for faster access to medicines, for governments to pay for medicines that haven't been necessarily proven adequately. So what are your thoughts on that phenomenon?
I think it's really important that people who become involved in community advocacy are actually supported by community groups to think sceptically about the agendas of pharmaceutical companies around that. I think it's a really important point that you raised, Narcis. I think we've also seen that in HIV too, certainly. I probably won't go into any of those examples. I'll learn to be quiet about some of those things. But yeah, it is important, obviously, that medicines are proven to be safe and effective. And safety is, both of those things are extremely important. Yeah, and that you don't have a kind of cut price knockoff agenda pushing things through. But then if you actually stop pharmaceutical companies spending money on all kinds of extraneous things through legislation, you could actually have a more channeled industry that actually does what it's supposed to do, perhaps. Or maybe you could fund public institutions to do that research instead.
Bridget, you focused on the situations where HIV, there was a very identifiable community that was at the highest risk and as you pointed out, very well organised, or in Ebola where it's very geographically focused and there's communities are very recognisable by general health disadvantage. But there are many areas of health where maybe there's a less identifiable community that in relation to the disease, say cardiovascular disease in our community, or in which it seems to be very much more generic. And so it's maybe harder to find out what is the community engagement process there for those who want to develop the drugs. Does that mean that we're doing it less effectively in the absence of those engagements, or do we know that, or what happens when there's not a clearly visible community that can come forward and be engaged with, or can be seen to be the natural counterpart?
John, the Consumer Health Forum does actually organise community representation across a whole range of different kinds of disease areas, including ones that you talked about there. And I think that online communities can be quite important as well. I suspect there is something different about infectious diseases, because infectious diseases are, communities in and of themselves that, do all those communitarian things like breed. And I think that might perhaps have something to do with why community involvement in research has been particularly focused on infectious diseases. But I think that there's no particular reason why you wouldn't want to have communities involved in other things. And when I think of, for example, the student that I had last year who was looking at chest binding for transgender and gender non-binary people, he worked with online communities to talk to him about his research as well, and so he was able to find people online to provide some of that. And so I think that possibly the internet gives us opportunities that haven't necessarily been fully explored.
Hi, Bridget. You tell a really compelling tale about why it's important to have communities involved in research. So thank you for that, because sometimes I get a bit cynical, and I guess my cynicism comes from my concerns that some community health groups, consumer health groups, are very heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we can preserve the independence of consumer health groups, or decide whether they are truly independent, or whether research driven by consumer health groups is actually pharmaceutical agenda driven.
Thank you for that wonderful question, Lisa. I think that's really, really important. One of the things that I think is important is to have absolute transparency about where the pharmaceutical industry has involvement in funding particular groups and in funding particular projects, because I think that is, and also to see the funding of health-based community organisations as being something that governments should take seriously in order to stop having these perverse incentives for people to end up in the pockets of pharmaceutical companies and being led in that particular way. Certainly in the late 90s in HIV, when, the internet existed, but we didn't seem to have access to it. And we seem to be quite dependent sometimes on pharmaceutical companies for information. And that was, quite scary at times, because then, as a person doing treatment advocacy, the pharmaceutical industry would then try to frame things in a particular way and to try to impose conditions on what we were able to tell people or not. And that was a very important part, I think, of politicising myself and people that I worked with around thinking about the problems of the pharmaceutical industry infiltrating community groups and perverting the agenda of community groups and stopping people speaking about their own lives, their own lived experience, and just using that as a kind of trajectory for their own ends. So it is really important. I think transparency is the first step there, because as government funding is ever diminishing, more and more people think, why shouldn't I take this money in order to achieve this end? But the process then begins of the influence that starts to take over.
Hi, my name's Kira Yubal. I've worked in HIV and TB in South Africa for 34 years, so I saw the whole emergence of HIV in the mid-80s, and I've worked for the last 11, probably more 20 years actually, in HIV and TB. So it's been interesting to see the same sort of community activism in South Africa. There was a group called TAC, Treatment Action Campaign. They were the ones that campaigned in a similar vein to get ARVs available in South Africa. We were, of course, fighting against people who were saying that HIV doesn't cause AIDS and you had to get better nutrition, and we had a health minister that was a complete disaster. So we saw all of that. My comment is that that was a very interesting community, and it was a very interesting disease in the people that it hit. And I think you're right in that it brought up the people who are very well educated and very well motivated to do that. My comment is that there's a number of diseases where there isn't that community, and the big one that we saw in South Africa was, of course, TB. Now, TB is not an emerging infectious disease. It's been around for... But a lot of people quite rightly pointed out that the last drug development that went on in TB was like before the 1970s. And so we were dealing with really old drugs to treat TB. And the thing that I've seen, the thing that I've noticed in South Africa is that now that TAC and community activists have achieved nearly everything they wanted to achieve with access to ARVs, they're turning their attentions to the TB drug. It's been fascinating to watch because it's been really exciting and, you know, place to working as an HIV physician. Now, in the last 2 years, I can see in South Africa, the interesting place to work is in TB because the new drugs are finally coming. Now, many of our infectious diseases are happening in poor countries, and we don't have communities that can fight. I don't know what to say about that, but that is true. We talk about a lot of your tropical diseases. They get very little attention, very little money. Pharmaceutical companies are not interested because they can't make a profit. And I'm interested to see this type of spill over into some of the other tropical diseases that are essentially neglected.
I think that's a fascinating comment that you've made there. I'm really glad that you brought that up because I would also say that it's no accident that South Africa was so important in leading the world on treatment access. And I would argue similarly to the influence of the gay liberation movement, meaning that you had people who were kind of trained in activism in your kind of gay Western world. In South Africa, you had these anti-apartheid trained activists. And if you look at the pictures of the protests, they're really, really similar. And so you had people who actually really, really knew how to change the world effectively, because that's what apartheid activists did, and how to actually deal with, you know, the consequences and the processes of political action there. Sorry, did you want to say?
Sorry, interestingly, the people who took the main lead in activism were actually in the gay community.
Yeah.
And they were following the models from the States, and they were the ones that were really active. And there was a guy called Zaki Ahmad, who was famously, he was himself HIV infected, and he refused to go on to treatment. And he was one of the people who led the charge against the current health minister, and he was prepared to charge her with genocide. So he was the obvious, but a lot of it was from the homosexual community, the gay community. And that, of course, did galvanise a whole lot of other things. And I would say, actually, the country that led access to treatment in Southern Africa was actually Botswana. They started an ARV program in 2001. And it took two things to change it in South Africa. The one was the charge of genocide against that minister, and the second one was the fact that she had to go in for a liver transplant, and her deputy took over and she put together a program. And that's what got it going.
Although the Botswana one was a kind of pharmaceutical-led scheme. It was the Bridging the Gap scheme, and it was in some ways less radical than the South African one, who kind of that pushed more for the generic drugs. But look, you probably know more about this than I do. But I just remember when Botswana announced their scheme, how it was very much in concert with the key pharmaceutical companies, whereas South Africa seemed to take a more
It was very mixed. There was a lot of activism to get the generics through, to actually just ignore copyright. There was also a big push from PEPFAR, President Bush's fund, and they were trying to push branded drugs. So it was a very mixed thing. And certainly I worked on one of the programs in Durban that was funded by PEPFAR, which was one of the first programs to get people onto ARVs, and it started with a drug trial, and it was seen as access, and they started a big clinic there. It was the second biggest clinic offering treatment before the government started. So it was a whole mixture of things. Also, Médecins Sans Frontières started up the first program in Khayelitsha in Cape Town, and a lot of activists there. So it was a very mixed thing in South Africa.
Yeah. And the action that TAC had against the Minister for Health in 2002 around the mother-to-child prevention, using the right to health, that was pretty amazing, I guess. And winning, although winning access to a really suboptimal antiretroviral that left people with drug-resistant HIV is maybe not, such a fantastic legacy in some ways, but the notion of it was really groundbreaking, I think. I didn't actually know about the genocide charge. I didn't know about the genocide.
I think it was about 2003. Originally, South Africa, there was a lot of argument. They were arguing that they could tell you how many deaths were occurring every year due to HIV, and there were people arguing that it wasn't that. But they calculated about 300,000 deaths a year, and that's where they came with the genocide story.
Okay.
And they were going to charge her with genocide. It didn't actually eventually go through because she went in for her liver transplant.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. And of course, TB is the greatest killer of people living with HIV now.
Yeah, it's still the leading cause of death probably in most of Southern Africa.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question which is potentially putting some pressure on the role of community and what communities are and what we mean by community? So we might think about some of these issues to do with focusing communities as groups of advocates as being related to identity politics. So then we can think about who it is that speaks on behalf of particular communities and a whole set of issues there about representation and so on. But I'm particularly interested in, I think, picking up on a couple of the comments about thinking about, for example, TB, or the example I'll use is Ebola, which I'll explain why in a minute, is thinking about how other groups, apart from the communities affected themselves, have actually in some ways promoted the interest of the communities in question more than the communities themselves. And in some cases that's because the members of the affected and infected communities are in many cases not at the table. They're just not part of the relevant discussions. So I mentioned Ebola because for 10 years I was on the MSF Research Ethics Board, and I was involved in the discussions with MSF, and they took a very strong stand that they would not support any placebo-controlled trials for any of the therapies that were trialed during the Ebola outbreak. So MSF, as a corporate body, I was at the meeting where all the medical directors were there from the different constituent countries of MSF, and it was a joint decision by MSF that implemented the kind of position that was presented going back to the 1988 HIV case. So they basically, MSF as an organisation, took a stand, and that brought them into direct conflict with the EBM fundamentalists and the FDA sort of advocates when it came to conducting those kinds of trials. So I think there's an interesting example where an NGO stands up for what they perceive to be community interests, but there was nobody from the relevant communities that were actually part of that conversation at all.
It's a fantastic issue to open up, Angus, and I think it was, I had that urge at the very beginning to do the, start with an apology thing by saying that I'm not going to get into the philosophical thing of defining what a community is. And then remembering something that Chris had said to me, don't apologise, just say what you're going to say. And so I didn't. But who fits and who doesn't fit into a community is always going to be fraught, and there is always going to be tension there, and there is no right answer. I think, in fact, the tension is incredibly productive. I am the president of the Australian Federation of AIDS Organisations. I'm not a gay man. I'm not living with HIV. I've never even injected drugs or sold sex. But my God, I've been to a lot of meetings and I've listened and I have argued, and eventually you can get to a point where you are allowed to be something. My friend Morenike, who has written, 150 papers on HIV ethics, is actually by training a paediatric dentist. And I don't know what her HIV status is. And she, narrow identity politics are not always useful, but sometimes they are important. It is important that people with HIV, for example, are able to speak for themselves and to not have people who are not, there are some life-changing moments in your life where if you haven't had a particular experience, you can't talk about it. Maybe childbirth is one of those too. You can't really talk about childbirth unless you've had one. And I think you can't talk about, the experience of living with Ebola, or surviving Ebola, or living with HIV, or any of those things. I think there's an opportunity now that there are actually groups of people who have survived Ebola, to get those people involved in what ongoing community discussions might have happening there. But yeah, sometimes people do just have to have that kind of the moral agency, I suppose, to try to imagine themselves into a particular position and make moral judgments about that. And it sounds to me that that's what MSF did. And I know there's a fantastic article written about how we should think about designing Ebola trials. That I remember reading it and then looking and seeing the date of it was 2007. And I think, oh God, this feels so current now, but it was well and truly, and it was probably part of those conversations that you were part of. So I suppose in any kind of community, it is important to have a process that determines who is and who is not able to speak on behalf of it, but to recognise that is always going to be an area of contention and fraughtness, and that there aren't kind of hard and fast rules that you can always instill there. Does anybody else want to have an answer to that question? Because it seems kind of funny to be pretending to have all the answers. Yes.
I'm probably the person in the room who knows least about all of this, but if you're talking about communities in general, I have found over time with different things that I've done that the bigger the community that is prepared to get behind an issue, in my experience, the better. And so that, by nature, doesn't just include people who are intimately involved with the situation, but people who care about the people who are intimately involved in that situation, the families and friends, the larger community who says, no, we're not going to have that. That's not okay. That's not who we are. We're going to have this, regardless of whether it's illness or racial issues or whatever. I think communities benefit by being greater than just the people who are immediately affected.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that.
Any other comments or questions, Narcis?
Just a quick question, or I'd like your thoughts on this issue. Here we've seen an example of where advocacy has been used to enhance equity. But do you also see there to be a potential for advocacy to create inequities? In the sense that the people who can make the most noise get what they want.
Look, I can't think of a specific example there, but if I could tell you a little story about something that happened in 1996, just at the time when all of the combination trials, the results were coming out, and the first protease inhibitor that was protease inhibitors are a particular class of antiretroviral drug, and they were seen as, they were kind of the third piece. When you put three drugs together with one of them being a protease inhibitor, you started to get this really big change. The first drug that was going to be released in Australia was the worst drug. It was a drug that, and I am no scientist, but I could read enough to see that it was a drug that had really, really poor bioavailability, had an absolutely outrageous dosing schedule. You had, ideally to get maximum, bang for your buck out of it, you had to drink it with grapefruit juice so that you were kind of inhibiting a liver enzyme to try to keep it in your body for a little bit longer. And it had a whole lot of cross-class drug resistance issues. And I saw the drug companies sweep in and take people off to islands and wine and dine them and try to, feed this notion that the most important thing was to get onto the drugs as soon as possible. This is for people who still had relatively unchanged immune systems. So they weren't people who were at imminent risk of developing AIDS, so people with HIV who were well. Arguably, these people had, 6 or 7 years to wait for better drugs to start taking a combination that was going to be really, really effective. And that was a very, very, very difficult time because there was advocacy from within medical profession in Australia to not ever say anything that was negative about HIV treatments. That, we had to completely change the discourse around AZT's poison to saying all antiretroviral drugs are fantastic, and if you can get onto this, it's marvellous. When, to me, there was a very, very real fear that you were going to get these, thousands of people with HIV in Australia taking a suboptimal drug that was then going to affect their subsequent, the subsequent impact of all other drugs. It ended up not being as bad as that the drug resistance issue wasn't as good, and drug development went really fast, so people were able to get onto better drugs faster. But there was this moment of a company trying to get market share in that way that was really terrifying, and it was really terrifying to see the way, particularly that they were able to kind of activate doctors around this very simplistic treatment good, treatment bad thing, and saying that people can't cope with a message more complex than, if you don't need to start treatment right now, if you start it next year, you're going to have these drugs that are so much better, and your chance of, living to be 90 goes right up.
Okay, I think that's perhaps a good place to stop. Would you like to join me in thanking Bridget very much for stimulating